The 2024 election between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump is ramping up to be one of the most competitive US presidential elections of all time. And if you don't believe me, let's look at the polls. Without Kennedy, the candidates are only 2 percentage points away from each other, and with Kennedy, it's a mere 1. And neither candidate with or without Kennedy gets 50% of the vote, which is completely insane. Neither candidate has half the people in the country who are voting that will actually support them or more. So this just first of all goes to show how generally unpopular both candidates are, and second of all, it goes to show how competitive the race is. So with that being said, let's look at the prediction markets and see who they think will win. So according to prediction markets, Trump has an average of about a 55% chance of winning this election, whereas Harris has an average of about 39. And this just goes to show how much of a meteoric rise Harris has had in the past few days. Because look, she went from a mere 2% chance just a month and a bit ago to now 39% chance of winning. And Biden had a meteoric fall, going from the front runner to now one of the last place finishers in this election cycle. And Trump has been declining day after day after day since Harris was picked as the Democratic nominee. So now I'm going to analyze this election, see who will win, and see if it is correct that Harris is having this meteoric rise, or is the hype overdone. So with that being said, to join the 2%, make sure to subscribe today. And thank you for watching, and as always, here's some news before the prediction starts, to help explain the context of this prediction. So first, the VP candidate JD Vance has found himself in some hot water. According to the New York Times, JD Vance has said some stuff like, quote, "I hate the police." And that's a quote from JD Vance. That is not me saying that, by the way. This is rhetoric that you don't often see from Republicans. Suffice to say, you almost never see this type of rhetoric from Republicans. And Vance is not just a Republican, he is the VP candidate under Donald Trump. And according to the New York Times, Trump pushes a pro-police agenda, so JD Vance is not really aligning with this agenda with that comment. But you might say, hey, Election Central, that is just one comment. That's not much. In the grand scheme of things, really, I can move past one comment. Well, can you move past more? He not only made the comment about police, he also said if he, meaning Trump, would just tone down the racism, I would literally be his biggest supporter. Pretty much verbatim saying that Trump is a racist. And remember, he is Trump's VP candidate. And Trump doesn't really like being crossed by people. One thing he likes about people is when they are loyal to him. And it seems like JD Vance has not always been loyal to Donald Trump. But again, you might say, hey, this is just 2 things. I can go past 2 things. This was so long ago. I really don't care. Well, there's more. He referred to Trump as a demagogue. A demagogue is not someone you want to be referred to as if you are a political candidate or just anyone in general. So, those are the facts that are presented to you. You can take with them what you want, but I'll just have it be known, JD Vance's side of the story. Basically, all of this was leaked by one individual who essentially was a friend of JD Vance, and after they conflicted on policy, they no longer were friends after that. These messages were then leaked, and you might say, well, these messages are probably fake. Well, there was a quote from JD Vance's team. It's unfortunate this individual chose to leak decade-old private conversations between friends. So these messages are legit, but they are a decade old. So these do not represent JD Vance's views now because they say verbatim that he's been open to the fact that some of his views began to change after becoming a dad. So his views may not be the same as they were, but those were in fact his views a decade ago. At least those were what he said his views were. So those were real text messages by JD Vance. And I thought that was interesting to put because maybe JD Vance is adversely affecting Trump's campaign. And it's almost as if Trump predicted this, because he kind of did. Trump likely wanted Doug Burgum, governor of North Dakota, but he opted to choose JD Vance due to none other than Eric Trump and Donald Trump Jr., his sons. I assume he's not talking about Barron Trump here. Donald Trump Jr. and Eric Trump basically convinced Trump to pick JD Vance over Doug Burgum last second. And if you're looking at the prediction markets, this checks out. Doug Burgum was the front runner for like the longest time, and then JD Vance suddenly rose in the ranks and became the VP candidate. And a lot of the news sources that broke the news were talking about how Donald Trump Jr. and JD Vance are essentially very good friends, etc. They apparently went super crazy when they heard Trump was about to pick Doug Burgum, saying, quote, "Why would you do something so stupid? He offers us nothing." And they love JD. They love the guy. They really want JD Vance as their pick. And I'll tell you why Trump wanted Burgum. I'll tell you what it seems like his two sons missed. That Trump himself apparently knew, or at least his sources knew, and he agreed with them at first before he was convinced otherwise. Doug Burgum is calm, he's cool, and he's collected. And he won't overshadow Donald Trump. Nobody will know who he is. Nobody will care who he is. He's a placeholder, but not only that, he has an inspiring story from zero to hero, from working on roofs to a Microsoft executive. He has money. He's a billionaire. He has political experience. He's a governor. He just won't overshadow Trump. He has no baggage. He has no skeletons in his closet, so to speak. JD Vance, on the other hand, is way more charismatic than Burgum, but has more skeletons in his closet. And Trump did not want someone with skeletons in his closet, but Donald Trump Jr. and Eric Trump were so enamored by Vance that they wanted Vance to be the pick. And Trump called Vance with the news 20 minutes before on social media. The one funny thing to take from this is Trump basically, it seems like he was like, I'm going to win anyway, so the VP pick doesn't really matter. It seems like the Vance pick was a little impulsive. From what I'm gathering, the Vance pick was impulsive, and mostly probably because Trump doesn't view that his VP is necessarily what matters most. He basically views that his own presidency, and he thought he was getting it regardless, is what matters most. And Burgum is the pick if the election is close, because neck and neck, you don't want to pick someone that will ruffle any feathers. But Vance is the pick if you know you have the election locked up. You know you have the election locked up, and you can have an ideological successor to replace you after your term limited, etc. So he basically was thinking, well, when I'm term limited, I could have someone continue the MAGA movement in JD Vance. Doug Burgum couldn't really do that. He wouldn't win an election to save his life, even though overall I think he was a pretty good candidate. But that's one of the reasons he wasn't picked. So that's why Vance was picked. But now it seems like Vance's pick wasn't necessarily the greatest idea. But even still, we'll see how this works out. We'll see future polls, and we'll see if there's any approval ratings released on Vance. But regardless, let's head on over to our next piece of news. And that is that Trump told Christians, quote, "You won't have to vote anymore if he's elected." So the news has run wild with this. And I'll tell you right here, they are taking this out of context. They are taking this too far. Trump has said things like dictator for a day, etc. We've heard all about it. But I'm just going to say this is way too far. If you actually look at what Trump was saying, he's not saying what basically the headlines make it seem like he was saying. He said, Christians, get out and vote just this time. You won't have to do it anymore. You know what? 4 years, it'll be fixed. You won't have to vote anymore, my beautiful Christians. He did not say you cannot vote anymore. Basically, these articles are insinuating that he will become a dictator. He will basically institute martial law and votes will not exist. That is basically the insinuation of these articles. You can say whatever you want, but that's what the articles are insinuating. That's what they're trying to get people to believe. But when he says you won't have to vote anymore, with anyone with any social skills or any skills at reading a sentence and understanding, reading between the lines, they know it means Trump is saying he will make this country so good that it's not necessary for them to vote because it won't really matter as the country is so good. No candidate can really screw it up. It'll be that good. And while I don't think this is likely, I think you should always vote. That is what Trump is saying. He's saying he'll make it so good it won't really matter who wins these next elections. And he's also saying just vote this time. Don't be lazy. In 4 years, you don't have to. And also because he won't be running in 4 years, so he really doesn't necessarily care as much if they vote in 4 years. I assume he won't be running in 4 years unless he somehow loses and then somehow wins the nomination, etc. But he's saying, you won't have to, just vote for me just this once. You don't have to do it anymore. It's so obvious he doesn't mean he's going to be a dictator. Either he means he's going to make the country so good, or he just really doesn't care if you vote anymore after you've already voted for him. Either way, he's not saying he's going to be a dictator. And with that aside, let's go to our final piece of news. And this is the Veepstakes. And remember last time when I said Josh Shapiro would become the front runner? Well, it's happened. Josh Shapiro has become the front runner in the Veepstakes. And we'll see. Josh Shapiro's influence in Pennsylvania is way higher than Mark Kelly's influence in Arizona, maybe even higher than Tim Walz's in Minnesota. Tim Walz would be higher if Minnesota actually mattered, but Minnesota is going Democrat anyway. His Midwest influence will matter, but Josh Shapiro is basically Tim Walz but better. One of Harris's biggest criticisms is her wishy-washy stance on the conflict in Gaza. Picking a Jewish vice presidential candidate can help her with that. Picking the governor of Pennsylvania can help her with everything else, can help her with the Midwest, etc. And he's also young like her. So he excels in every avenue that she wants. His only thing is that he's a little new. But Kelly is also new. So it's probably going to be either Shapiro or Tim Walz. But either way, I think Shapiro is the best candidate for her chances at victory. And regardless, that's my newest take on the Veepstakes, which is pretty similar to my last take. But I just wanted to update you on that. And now we go to the prediction. So no matter what, the safe states will stay the same. It seems like the election is becoming closer. So states like Oregon, states like New Jersey, obviously Vermont, Connecticut, Delaware, Maryland, DC, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Maine's 1st District will go to the Democrats safely. And now that the election is close, some of these states like Oregon, like New Jersey, can be classified as safely going to Harris. However, the states that have gone to Trump time and time again by 10 to 20 to 30 percentage points will still go to Donald Trump. He's been slipping a little in the polls, but not enough that these states wouldn't have a solid chance, in fact, an almost 100% chance of going to Donald Trump. But now that we have our battleground states, I'm going to analyze them individually and see who will win this election. So as you can see, Harris jumps off to an early lead, but you'll soon see that Trump actually starts breaking into this lead and catching up to Kamala Harris. But we'll first start with the states that I view will most solidly go to Trump or Harris, and then we'll go more and more to the closer states. So we obviously have to start with Ohio. Even though Vance is getting a little more controversial, this is normal for a vice presidential candidate. Not as much dirt was on him before he became vice presidential candidate. And then once Trump picked him, there was more research on him, etc. And that's why the dirt is produced right now rather than like a year ago or whatever. That's part of the reason the dirt was produced, because he's a more prominent figure. So that's just something that's going to happen. You'll see with Harris's picks, something's going to be dug up on them. Maybe not something to the extent of Vance, where he's switching basically from moderate Republican to more of a populist, but we'll see something. Right, so that always happens. Vance is no Pence, Vance is no Burgum. He's no average conservative, if you will. He's Vance. He's a MAGA guy. He's not going to be cookie cutter. Pence and Burgum were picked because they were cookie cutter. Burgum would have essentially been Pence 2.0. And Pence and Burgum, they really don't have controversy. Nothing is really produced against them that's really anything of value. And that's their main draws. Vance is different. He's a little bit of a risky pick. But regardless, Ohio loves him. Ohio elected him in a competitive Senate race, even though it was pretty close. He was against a congressman, so that kind of explains it. Ohio elected him. He essentially became the poster child of the Midwest after producing the Hillbilly Elegy story. He is going to win Ohio for Trump, and Trump was going to win Ohio anyway, as Trump has done very well in Ohio in past elections. But next, we have our two states towards the West Coast, which are Colorado and New Mexico. I usually classify them pretty interchangeably, and again, it's going to happen. I don't see either of these states flipping. Remember, they're states that pretty solidly went to Biden, pretty decently went to Clinton. They're going to Harris, right? And the one thing you could say about the popular vote, these national polls, is that the popular vote usually goes to Democrats, whereas the electoral vote has gone to Trump in 2016 while the popular vote went to Clinton. And with that being said, saying Harris is +1 in the popular vote doesn't mean she'll win the election. She can still lose the election despite being +1. Remember, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by over 2 percentage points and still lost the election by a pretty decent margin, a pretty large margin actually in terms of electoral vote. So Harris can win the popular vote by 2 percentage points and still lose this election. Don't take this at face value. But the fact that the popular vote tallies are pretty similar to 2016 numbers, it has shifted to the right 4 points, but even with the rightward shift, Colorado and New Mexico will still go to Harris. They might be a little closer than 2020 margins, but they're going to Harris nonetheless, bringing her just shy of 200 electoral votes. But still, Trump has the state of Texas to back him up. And see, Trump is winning in most of these popular vote tallies, and with the same logic as giving Harris Colorado, Trump will not lose Texas. Texas is a state Trump will only lose if he significantly loses a popular vote, and there's a large shift towards the left, which is obviously not going to happen. By the fact that Trump is leading in most polls by a pretty large margin, he's going to win the state of Texas. Texas really won't be a factor in this election. In 2020, everyone was so concerned about it on the Republican side and happy about it on the Democrat side, but Trump still won it by almost 6 percentage points. So Texas is not going to change too much. In fact, it'll change to go even more Republican than in 2020, even though it has had a leftward shift in past elections. Florida will vote pretty similarly to Texas, also going to Donald Trump. Florida has had a rightward shift in the past few elections, and Florida polling is looking very, very promising for the Republican Party. As you can see, Trump is up by as much as plus 10 in some of these polls against Harris, and he averages around plus 9 against Harris. That's enough to say that he's pretty obviously going to win in the state of Florida, bringing himself to 218 electoral votes, and those two states alone whop a wielding 70 electoral votes. And also, it should be mentioned that Florida is Trump's home state, which will give him a little bit of a boost as well. And California is Harris's home state, just to mention that. And I don't think that will give her a boost at all, which is why she's looking for someone from the Midwest, just as Trump did. The Midwest is essentially the biggest battleground in this election, it having so many electoral votes and so many battleground states. In fact, there are 4 battleground Midwest states, and each of them offers over 10 electoral votes. So that's why the two candidates are going so hard for the Midwest, because the Northeast doesn't really matter too much in this election. The West Coast doesn't matter too much. The South doesn't matter as much. But the Midwest is where it's at in this particular election. And the Midwest tends to vote in basically blocks. They all voted for Biden. They all voted for Trump except Minnesota, etc. You can see they all vote pretty similarly in each election. Every time they vote for Democrats, pretty much all vote for Democrats. And except for this one, when they all vote Republicans, obviously except Minnesota, which is the longest active streak of voting for Democrats, they're all voting Republican, right? So the Midwest is really the area that both candidates are focusing on. And that's why I'm going to save it until the end. But next we get to the state of Maine. So Harris has had some gains in the Northeast. The Northeast was an area that maybe people were thinking, oh, Trump might actually chip away at it in this election. In 2016, there was a scare for the Democrats in the Northeast, in New Hampshire, as well as Maine. It was a little scary for Democrats that they were losing the Northeast, which is an area that they had relied on. They had basically counted on it. It's like Trump assuming North Dakota will go to him. We all know it will. Democrats assumed the Northeast would go to him. And when Trump proved that he could actually win some areas in the Northeast, or at least come close to it, it scared Democrats, and that's why there's been so much polling on New Hampshire, on Maine. But it looks like a similar scare won't happen in 2024, where Harris is leading in polls in New Hampshire, and she'll likely win in the state. And it'll be a little closer than Colorado and New Mexico, but it'll still go to Harris. Actually, it'll be probably a few percentage points closer, and Maine will go to Harris by a slightly larger margin than New Hampshire did. Maine usually votes slightly more Democrat than New Hampshire. Maine second, on the other hand, will go to Donald Trump. And Nebraska second will tilt towards Harris because it's the urban part of Nebraska. It did go to Joe Biden in 2020 by a pretty significant margin. If you don't believe me that a part of Nebraska will go to Harris, you might believe the markets, which say that has a 66% chance of going to Harris. So now, this election is still intense. Who will win? Well, we don't know just yet. But we do know that the winner has to win a decent amount of these remaining states to win this election. So all of these states are wildly important in this upcoming election. And the next least close state, a little bit of a tongue twister, will be Minnesota, home of Governor Tim Walz. If Harris picks Tim Walz, she basically shores up Minnesota. But here's why picking Tim Walz doesn't matter, right? If Harris is at the point where she needs Minnesota to win the election, she's already lost. Because Minnesota votes like the Midwest, only slightly more Democrat. Let's look at the tipping point state. And Minnesota only has a 1% chance of being the tipping point state. So in this election, it doesn't necessarily mean as much as some of the other states because basically we all know that if Minnesota is going red, so is Wisconsin, so is Michigan, so is Pennsylvania, so is North Carolina, etc. And Trump will have already won. So Minnesota doesn't necessarily matter too much, which is why she won't pick Tim Walz. And not only does Minnesota have an 83% chance of going to the Democrats, according to those who actually put their money where their mouth is, Minnesota is also going to Harris by as much as plus 10 in recent polls. And as you can see, Minnesota is likely going to Harris. And here's another reason why I think Shapiro should be picked as the VP candidate for Harris. Look, Shapiro not only wins in Pennsylvania, he wins in Minnesota. Shapiro would win the Midwest, he would win this election, and if Harris picks Shapiro, maybe the Shapiro bandwagoners will join Harris and will vote for Harris. So a pick of Shapiro will drastically change this polling. And so that's why you got to stay tuned for some future predictions. But as for this map, our next state is Virginia. So polling in Virginia is a little bit more optimistic than political betting websites. Polling in Virginia actually has Trump up in most polls. The political betting website Polymarket has Virginia likely going to Democrats. And for that reason, and many others, Virginia will tilt towards Democrats. Due to Trump's ability to poll really highly in the state of Virginia, in a manner that he couldn't do in 2016 or 2020. And in 2016, Virginia was actually a little close. Clinton only won it by 5. Virginia is one of those states not to sleep on. Virginia could go to Donald Trump, and it could go to Harris. It could go either way. It is not like New York, Vermont, etc. Virginia is in play for Donald Trump. Now that Virginia is going to Harris, but only by a tilt, you can assume how the rest of this election will go. But now we'll go to Michigan. And Michigan has a pretty high chance of being the tipping point state at a 16% chance. Michigan, according to Polymarket, will likely be the closest state in this election cycle, with it essentially being 50-50. And polls in Michigan do not corroborate this. Trump is leading in most polls in Michigan. This one was sponsored by a partisan sponsor, but the rest do have a similar story, where Trump is leading by +2 or even as much as +3 in Michigan. Some of these polls do have Harris up, but very few. So, it seems like Trump will win in the state of Michigan, but only very narrowly. But still, this essentially signifies that he will likely win the rest of the Midwest. And let's see Wisconsin. Despite only having 10 electoral votes, it has a 16% chance of being the tipping point state. And why is that? Well, like Michigan, it's also really close, being even in the last poll. And this is one of the few states where Trump does better against Shapiro than against Harris, which is interesting to me. But regardless, it seems like Trump is winning in the recent polls in the state of Wisconsin, but just barely. So it'll tilt towards Donald Trump. And now we get to our final state in the Midwest, which is the state of Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania, in most polls, is going to Donald Trump. It's pretty even, but it seems to be going to Donald Trump in most polls, as you can see. This was just one poll, and then most polls do have Donald Trump winning in Pennsylvania, but by extremely narrow margins. So as you can see, the Midwest is extremely finicky. Just one little flip, one little mistake, one little bad phrase could flip 3 states in this election, if not 4, right? So it's impotent that the candidates do not mess up from here on out, because this election will be so close. Honestly, it's probably going to be the closest election since 2000. And we've had some pretty close elections in the past. But still, Trump still needs 7 more electoral votes to win. In terms of electoral college, it probably won't be like the closest. But in terms of the vote difference in the states that actually decide the election, it will be close. But now still we get to North Carolina. And North Carolina is likely going to Donald Trump, just like it did in 2016 and 2020. One of the few swing states to go to Trump in both elections, and it's continuing to go to Trump. It is going to Trump by as much as +6 and as little as +3. So North Carolina is not really a problem for Donald Trump, and he wins in that state. And now we get to Georgia, where Trump will also win. The state of Georgia is in the South, a group of states that have reliably voted Republican for a long time. Georgia did go to Biden in 2020, but it will go to Trump in 2024. And the same goes for both Arizona and Nevada, which both have over a 60% chance of going to Donald Trump. And this isn't just from speculation, this is from polling too, where Trump is leading by as little as +3 and as much as +8. And in Nevada, there's a similar story. Trump is leading by as much as +2 and up by as much as +10. So he wins in both states. Nevada seems to be a little closer than Arizona on average, but regardless, he wins both Arizona and Nevada, winning this election 312 to 226. So that's my updated election prediction, and thank you for watching.